I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. Join us in this November 2018 episode of Poetry of Predicament with an internet blogger, journalist, and commentator with a systems view of what's going on, a piercing, straight-talking journalist and blogger and commentator, Rob Seimetz. Pleasure to speak with him. Look forward to a spicy conversation with Rob. You know, I've got a sense of urgency that's been growing this year like no other time in my life. And I get so excited when I get around people where there's a certain amount of resonance between us. You know, I really want our voices to get out there. And this seems like the most important time and the most important conversation that humanity's ever confronted. And so I'm for those two reasons, elements seem to be at play in you. And so I'm very excited to give you a chance to speak, because you do a great job in your own podcast and your own articles. Particularly in the podcast, bringing that out in other people. So what I'd like to most do is, first welcome you. I guess I should have sort of officially start this Poetry of Predicament podcast and officially say that, I do consider you one of those kindred spirits, one of those people with whom I have an obvious resonance. And where I got that impression was listening to you, I guess it's a couple of months ago now, on Patrick's Last Born in the Wilderness with Kevin from New Zealand. And, I just couldn't have imagined a more potent group of the three of you speaking about the issues that really matter. And being able to then do a little bit more reading, particularly of your own writing. There are some places I'd love to visit today, some particular pieces of your writing that really have struck me hard. But what I'd love to do first is ask if you would introduce yourself, and in terms of what's the track that got you here, being the kind of voice that you are.
I think the first thing to keep in mind, and now I can openly talk about this, where before I kind of had to hide this a little bit in my writings and on the radio show, is that I worked as a state investigator for the state of Florida for about 8.5 years. And through some events that happened there, and we could spend a whole hour talking about it, but I'll just say some events that happened in my life there is really what kind of got me into what's going on in our world. And, things were supposed to be easy for my generation, and we were supposed to have it as good as our parents were. And that's just not the case. And I needed to know why. And that kind of took me on a journey and took me to places I never thought would happen. And I wanted to do something about it, kind of like you, when you find something out and you find out what's happening in this world and just how dire the situation is, you want to do something, and you try to find your way, what your spin is of it. And for me, it's an investigator. Try to take an investigative look into things and try to inspire people to move forward in such a dire time. It's the hardest thing to do. That's the thing I've figured out. It's so easy to point out what's wrong, but trying to point out what we need to do about it is the difficult work. that I think we're all trying to do.
Mm-hmm. Can you say a little bit more about what kind of investigation that you did?
Sure. So I have a couple things that I did. First, I worked for the Florida Department of Health. I investigated medical licensees, so like doctors, nurses, dentists, pharmacies. And I came in at a time, this is something I've wanted to share with people that I haven't shared, is I came in at a time where the opioid crisis was at an epidemic in Florida, and 7 people a day were dying. And I investigated some of the largest prescribers of oxycodone in the country. One of them in particular was a doctor that, just to put it in perspective for people, this was around 2011. So the average amount of time the average amount of pills of oxycodone that a pharmacy like a Walgreens was was ordering for the year was 65,000 units. This doctor ordered 964,000 units of oxycodone in a year. So that just kind of gets you into a little bit about my background and seeing how that investigation transpired. Not really particularly that, but looking into the opioid crisis and seeing just really this could have been solved in a much different way. So that's a little bit of investigative background. I also did financial crimes for almost 3 years, where I investigated like securities fraud. If people are familiar with the show American Greed, that's on CNBC, I did investigations like that, investment fraud.
Wow, fascinating. That's some interesting background. Do you still do anything like that?
I do. And now I'm at the point again where I would rather not. I think if my current employer found out that I would be talking about a lot of this stuff, I don't know how they'd feel about it, but I still am in the investigative field. I'll put it that way.
Got it. Thank you. All right. So that got you started, and something had you want to put a voice on it, not just investigate, but also put a voice on it. Can you say what that motivation is in you? What's the calling that you're hearing inside of yourself?
Well, I think we have to go back to, this is something I've wrote about, is that we all have turning points in our lives, I believe. And sometimes those turning points can become defining moments. And a defining moment for me was, I used to work alongside the DEA a lot in my investigations. I became very friendly with the DEA. I mean, I was a young investigator. I was 27 years old when I started. I was in prime age to get federally employed, and they recruited me to work for them. And I went through the testing. There was 500 applicants in Florida that applied. I tested number 2. And what happened was I ended up not getting the job. It was all supposed to be a done deal, but I didn't get the job. And I didn't get the job because, so this was in 2011. In 2006, right after I graduated college, I applied. Well, you have to say how many times you've experimented with marijuana. I've experimented with marijuana 7 times in my life. But the dates I put in 2006 didn't match the dates I put in 2011. So they told me no. But I was good enough to testify for them in criminal court. I was good enough to write sworn affidavits, but I wasn't good enough to work for them. And I thought, this is such bullshit. Yeah. And that kind of got me on my journey a little bit. It got me reading Jeremy Scahill. I read Dirty Wars, and I realized how corrupt the Democrats were as well as the Republicans. And it just, I started reading more and more. And I'm sure kind of you share this similarity where you binge read. Like I binge read for probably 3 or 4 years before I ever even decided to start writing something.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was my first attempt. My first attempt, and I guess my calling to write, was I went to this meeting where it was a Red Warrior tribe meeting, and they just got done with Standing Rock. And they came and talked about what happened at Standing Rock, and they showed the rubber bullet wounds, the bite marks from dogs, videos, photographs. And I don't know why, but after that meeting, I said, I've got to write about this. And that was the start.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks for that. That sounds like a very appropriate, sacred rage.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you work hard. That's what you're told. You work hard, you'll get ahead. And I worked really hard at the Florida Department of Health. I ended up coming back there, I should say, backing up after I did my stint as financial crimes investigator. I came back there as a manager. They got me back. So I was on a mission to prove myself, and I felt like I proved myself. And then someone told me I didn't over some technicality.
Mm.
And that little bit kind of helps you unravel everything that this culture is about, the myths that we're told.
You cover a lot of ground. You address a lot of different aspects of our situation, of our global situation and our national situation, just by the guests that you bring onto your podcast and your articles. I'm curious if these days, do you have a particular subject or set of subjects that you just can't shake off, that they really keep coming up to the forefront for you, that keep showing up and won't let you go?
I think it's interesting you asked that, because it's something I've been talking to a lot of people about, and that's the rise of the far right here in the United States. That's something I can't shake off. I just actually yesterday did an interview with Shane Burley, who covers the far right and Truth Out and a lot of other media outlets. And, what I'm trying to do is link some of us who are in the environmental movement and talk about abrupt climate change and near-term human extinction, link that to the far right and the rise of far right movements and far right leadership, even in the world. Like we have Bolsonaro in Brazil and Modi in India. I think these are things we need to pay attention to, and we need to link to climate change. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's prevalent here in Oregon. I mean, I know you're in Oregon too, so you've probably read about all the events that happened in Portland. And ever since I moved here in April, I've just been binge reading about all of it. And that's what I can't shake off, because I think people need to understand that while methane release is going to happen in the Arctic and it's going to be catastrophic, what do you think is going to happen in the streets when society collapses? These people are organized, they're training, they know how to use weapons, they know how to recruit, they have a militaristic view of their organizations. I think it's something we need to pay attention to.
Yeah. Well, I'm absolutely with you. I spent a very short time in law enforcement and a far longer time working with gang kids to get them, either to a more peaceful place within their community or out of the gangs completely. And in both of those environments, I got kind of a grittier taste of what is really going on in our world. And perhaps this is what you're talking about as well, but what I've seen for far longer than I've really known about privilege, known about whiteness, is the immense privilege that most of the people that I know in my circles, especially here in Oregon, where it is so white, we don't have to pay attention. And it's so relatively peaceful. Down here, I can tell you is in Southern Oregon, we just don't hear about any of that stuff. When it happens in Portland, we don't hear about it on the news in Medford. And I find that an excruciating irony that we have so much white privilege still in this country, so thick. And I've come to call it kind of a sleep that we're all in. And what you're describing is 3 or 4 layers back from where I've tried for the past couple of years to interact with very dear friends, very thoughtful people. These are heartful people, great little communities and so on. But there's so much insulation between that kind of new agey, fluffy, well, we're gonna do something to feel good, do some recycling or change light bulbs or whatever. It still takes my breath away that there is that much insulation for so many people that it just doesn't exist. The kind of stuff you were just describing just does not exist. It's not on their radar at all. So I guess all that was just a long-winded way of saying I'm completely with you.
But a question I have for you, because I come from Florida, and this is something I noticed in Florida, and I'm starting to notice here. And I mean, I've only been here 7 months, so you would know more than me. But do you see in Oregon a tale of 2 different states? I saw that in the election. I saw in this most recent election that there was, more progressive type values in different parts of the state where the rest of the state is red. I mean, red to the point where there's armed militias taking over buildings, red.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I've seen that since day one moving here back in 97, I think it was. Just to start with, I've never experienced such a frothing at the mouth intensity of anti-tax fervor as is here. I would hear the kind of blather that would come out of their mouths, well, we've got to cut all the fat out of education, and this is after they've been doing that for 30 years. It's just insane, just an insanity that way. And yes, there's absolutely a split, maybe 2 or 3 of them, I don't know, but in Oregon, because, the vast majority of voters are in the big city, and the big city is Portland and to some degree down in Salem and so on. And that's who gets the votes, and that's who gets into office and so on. And you're right, the background far right or just white is everywhere else, and it's unapologetic, and it is definitely growing. It is getting more and more traction with the current administration. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I actually, for work, I travel throughout the state of Oregon, and there's been places that I've told, don't go there. If you go there, you won't be safe. It is like the Wild West, is how it's been described to me by some people I know.
Yeah. Hoo-ah. To just kind of loop back for a moment, when you were describing, what has your attention, to respond to the last question, I'm just now working on my second book. My first book I released last year. It's called The Impossible Conversation. And within a few weeks of getting the first book out, I realized I had been too polite. It was my first book, and I tried my best to put out something that's readable and that people would want to read. And given what it's the same subject matter that we're covering today, I don't need to worry too much about trying to attract a big audience, because it'll never have a big audience. In any case, I've got a second book coming out now, and with that book is a companion workbook. And what I'm trying to do is lay out the world as I see it, what got us here to this predicament-laden world. And like you were saying at the very beginning, so what are we going to do about all this? And really, more appropriately, I think that we both know is what will be the quality of our presence? Who will we be? in the face of this predicament-laden world, because I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it seems like we're pretty aligned that it's really too late functionally to do anything at scale that's going to slow down any of the major predicaments that we've got going on. So I've been, kind of connecting dots that rarely get even talked about on their own, much less connected. The one that came to mind when you were just talking was connecting the business as usual paradigm and the collapse of that paradigm, and how that paradigm has been, since day one, founded in violence. That we are actually a culture absolutely founded in every dimension on some of the most extreme expressions of violence that humanity's ever known. So let me just put that out there as a spark, and if you have any response.
I actually just listened to this podcast with Gabor Mate and Russell Brand, and it was brilliant. And I think where this violence comes from is this trick that some of the powers that be have instilled on people, is that the concept of nationality, that we are so welded to nationality that it's become an addiction, and that nationality has us avoid our common humanity. And I think that's where a lot of the violence comes from. I just read this great article in Gods and Radicals, which I'd highly recommend to anyone who listens to this. I think they put out some of the best writing out there in the world. And the article was about World War I, and how World War I really established national identities. And I see that as really something that's accelerated our violence, is national identities. And not to mention social constructs, of course, we'd have to look at how we colonized the Americas, and how we became so successfully at colonizing them, that capitalism wasn't really, we didn't know if it would work or not, but it was built on the back of the indigenous people and Africans that really made capitalism successful, and that was through violence and through identities. So this concept of identities, I think, is really having us avoid our common humanity, and it's gotten us into a lot of trouble that we're in now. It's a big part.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, Gabor Mate's incredible. He's been at it, the same conversation for a long time, and it's just barely, his conversation is just barely getting the light of day beyond what he has been talking about for a long time. I find pieces of the roots of his conversation in the whole notion of becoming trauma aware as a culture, or in various agency levels. That's been a really big trend in the past couple of years, to have people really get a sense of, I don't know if the name ACEs means anything to you, but at the adverse childhood experiences is this fundamental shift in how people speak with one another, relate with one another at all. But it's especially potent as a distinction for folks who work on the front lines of healthcare or mental health or social services. And this idea of adverse childhood experiences being the starting point for a thread that goes through all of our lives. So they've got a survey that one can take. It takes a few minutes to answer a few questions, and you can basically tally up your score for how many adverse childhood experiences that you more than likely have, and then look at your own health history, and to see how have those experiences affected your physical health, not just your mental health. And again, he's been at that for, I'm guessing, 20 years now that I'm aware of. So it's exciting that there's some thread of that opening up. And I guess it's not a moment too soon.
Yeah, I really just recently discovered him, and I just was blown away by his work. He's absolutely brilliant, and he's correct in that we don't look at things a certain way. We have a certain way of looking at things, that we don't take a different perspective on things like he does with addiction. I think there's a deeper sense of that just in our society at large.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't know if you got a full answer in when I was asking about what has your attention these days. You did mention about the far right and about their kind of getting themselves prepared for some sort of larger scale presence in our culture. Are there other issues that are also rattle you some?
Well, of course, climate change, of course, monitoring the Arctic. I think anyone who's listening to this conversation is probably doing the same. The Brazilian rainforest would be one thing. Now with Bolsonaro being elected, is that going to be destroyed? And particularly the uncontacted tribes that are in Brazil and Peru area. It's some of the last vestiges of really non-Western people that haven't conformed to this society, that have a ancient and deep knowledge that we will destroy. That's something that concerns me, because yeah, we can't get out of this situation, but I think those are some of the people that can really offer us ways to move forward.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that they have a intimate connection with the land, I think that's something we don't have anymore. And I think it's causing this madness. I'm starting to question it for myself. I thought moving here from Florida to Portland, everything would be roses. And let me tell you, I am so happy I'm here compared to Florida. But one thing I realize is that there's this void in me. And the void is that I'm not where I grew up. I'm from Chicago, and I really just started thinking about my connection to that area and that land and my family and generations of my family that has been there. And sometimes I question if I made the right decision of moving here, if I should have moved back to where my roots are. And I think about that too, because my brother-in-law lived in Germany for 2 years. And he told me the story about how all of the coworkers he he lived in Stuttgart. They all had little mini apartments that they maybe share together in Stuttgart during the week. And then they'd go back to their hometown where their family grew up generation after generation on the weekends. And that you don't leave where you came from.
Mm-hmm.
That you would be extremely, it would take generations for you to get acclimated into that town if you moved to a new town. And I'm not saying that we need to weld ourselves to, sorry, that's my dog. I don't know if you can hear that.
I can. It's okay.
So I don't know if that's the answer, but being connected to the land, I think sometimes if just taking a page out of Derek Jensen's book, if we were more connected to the land, we would know the answers of what to do moving forward, because we'd be fighting for the land that we're intimately connected with. And we're not there anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't think, and that's the other thing. I mean, I don't think going out in the middle of nowhere is going to make that happen. Also, I don't think that's the end all be all fix. I think it's something deeper that we're missing.
Yeah. 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 We're definitely in the neighborhood right now. In this conversation, we're in the neighborhood of the this is the conversation. These are the notions that kept coming through time and time again in working with Carolyn and in doing the research for my book and for really this whole body of work, I kept asking the question, what got us here? Why are we here? What? And the answer kept coming back that we've disconnected. And I agree with you that there is very little chance that we're going to go back to any more romantic notion of how the past was, or the noble savage, and how all indigenous tribes were wiser than us, or more connected to the land or animals and so on than we are, because not necessarily. I agree with you that it's not the answer, the answer for today's human beings. But there does seem to be some deeper definition of reconnection. Kind of like what the work that reconnects that Joanna Macy and Molly Young Brown have put together. They kept running into that same notion of reconnection, but I think you're onto something, that there's a new definition of reconnection that we need to literally craft from nothing. We need to reinvent or invent a language with which we can even talk about this.
And I think we need to, like you said, you just said it earlier in this conversation, that you realized you were too polite in the first book, and now you're just going to say it how it is.
Yes.
And I feel like that's something we need to do as a people, better. We need to improve. I have same self-critiques for myself, where sometimes I walk away, I was like, I should have just said it and said how I really feel, and cut to the chase, because those of us that are looking into this predicament and looking into what's happening in our world, we long for those conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And in order to get more of a community, we need to start having the courage to have them. But it's a delicate slope to have. You need to find an inspirational way to do it. I had a conversation last week where I was talking to somebody, a coworker of mine, or a friend of mine. I think it was a friend of mine. I was telling her how I felt about what's happening with our world as far as a climate perspective. And I could tell she was deeply depressed after I told her what I think. And she said, well, now let's think of something hopeful. And I thought that's the problem, is that there isn't anything hopeful as far as solving the problem. There's hope in day-to-day modifications that we can do with the time we have left. And that can happen at any time. I mean, some people have said, you're so worried about, I guess I've been accused of living in the future, right? And I think that's what a lot of us go through, is that you're living in the future, you're not living in the present. And I think we all realize too, at the same time, I could walk outside the door and get hit by a bus tomorrow, but it's what's meaningful in our lives. I mean, I don't look at my day job as I like my day job, but I don't look at it as like it's my life's work.
Mm-hmm.
What you're doing right now, and what this conversation right now is to me, my life's work. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. That seems like you've landed at the place I was asking in my first question, is, what's the calling you hear? So thank you for looping us all the way back to there.
Well, and something I should add that people who are listening to this may not know this is, I'm going to be having a son here in February. Mm. So this is what I want to leave for him, is the writings, the radio show. It's for him to look at. I hope I have, if there's any hope I have, it's the one thing of hope I have, is that one day he's old enough to where I can play some of this stuff for him, and he can understand what was on his father's mind, as he was coming into this world and just before he came into this world.
Yeah, brilliant. Brilliant. Well, I wish that for you. Absolutely. There was a little fragment of what you just shared just a couple of moments ago about someone's comment, offhanded comment to you that, well, you're just living in the future and you're not being present, something along those lines.
Yeah. Yep. That's what someone told me.
So I'm curious what your experience is, because I've grown really kind of short-tempered with that kind of comment from people, because my experience of our culture at large, with rare exception, people are not nearly as present as they'd like to think they are. When I look at, when I'm talking about like what got us here, and I talk about the disconnection, the shorthand that I use is we've disconnected from our deeper selves, from each other, and from the earth. And every once in a while I'll throw in from our own soul, but that's a whole nother topic, and that'll be a part of the book. Most people can kind of get that as a brief way to lay out the disconnection. And they'll kind of nod and say, okay, yeah, sure, I can kind of get that. But it doesn't really sink in. It doesn't really get real till we start to talk about, so what is that? What are the costs of that disconnection? What does it cost us to disconnect from our deeper selves, from our ability to be in right relationship with others, and what has it cost us to disconnect from the earth? And I usually start with the disconnection from earth, because it's so damn easy. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. It's like, it's literally, there's pages and pages. If you don't want to talk about climate change, that's fine. We can talk about any of these hundreds of other metrics of the extraordinary impact of humanity on planet Earth. I'm wondering if you have any experience to talk about yourself when you have this kind of conversation with people. Are there particular pieces that trigger you or annoy you, or that have surprised you in a good way?
I think what annoys me is people focusing on mindless stuff as their priorities, stressing out over things that aren't really there to me, aren't really that stressful. I feel like looking at abrupt climate change and near-term human extinction really puts your priorities in focus. And one thing that I read in this book called The Natural Alien that I really enjoy is the author was saying something along the lines of, when there's an argument, that to turn it back on the person. So if somebody says that I'm living in the future, then I would say to them, okay, well, what's living in the present looking like for you? Watching The Walking Dead, Game of Thrones, worshiping celebrity culture. That's your present. I'm focused on what's really the most important things.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think one thing that I'm starting to find the older I get too is, you know, I'm not looking for friendship where I can have meaningless, polite conversations. I'm looking for friendship where I can have deeper connections and deeper conversations, and I can learn from somebody. I'm not going to learn from somebody by them expelling of, you know, why the local sports team is in that place.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we all need our escapism, and I'm not saying that. I use escapism as well, but that isn't how I want to base my friendships off of, as forms of escapism that we can talk about.
Yeah. 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 I'm just laughing because I've really just, I guess I have kind of I've always had kind of an odd orientation toward life in this culture. You know, I can remember back Heck, when I was like 8 or 9 years old, I was watching Jacques Cousteau specials on the TV about, the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau and so on. And I remember thinking then that this culture is crazy, that we're already back then we were killing the planet. Jacques Cousteau would, at some point in every single one of his shows would tell us about the damage being done. And if it doesn't stop, this entire whatever he's talking about will be dead. And sure enough. And so why I'm laughing is the irony as I look at who've been my friends, what have been the focus, what have been the most exciting relationships that I've had, the most enriching relationships that I've had in my life. And they've rarely had anything to do with the workaday world or the business as usual paradigm. Huh.
Well, I think too, at least for me, and I'm sure this, to speak for you a little bit, I'm sure that you share this, is even if you do have a business as usual relationship in the working world with somebody, what I've found is after that's over, I really think about it when it gets far out and think about how to extrapolate that to now and like to this larger picture of what's happening with geopolitics, the environment, all of it. Mm-hmm. And it's easy for me. I guess it could be incredibly easy for me, and it sounds like for you because we have experience working with government. Yeah. It sounds like you have experience with that as well. So it's a pretty easy thing to do.
Yeah. I'm curious. In light of that, and the chance that we both have to speak on a regular basis with people who have something to say at this level. The vast majority of humanity has nothing to say in these conversations. They just, what? But you and I, we get to meet and dive deep with people who do have something to say. And I'm curious if you would share some of the names, the folks that have been inspiring to you, either recently or in that early time, that early kind of ramping up to now that you were describing. Who has been inspiring to you?
I'd say I have a group of mentors that really have mentored me throughout the process. And the first would be Mike Sliwa. I feel like Mike and I are kindred spirits. I feel that I have this really deep connection with him, and I can't explain it. It's like, it's something the very first time I talked to him, I just felt this kinship with Mike, and Mike's been a very good, guide and mentor for me throughout the past couple of years. Patrick Farnsworth, as of recently, me and him just, had like a 2.5-hour conversation privately.
Yeah.
Just talking about our lives and sharing more about each other. I think he's fantastic. Somebody else too is Eric Draitzer from Counterpunch Radio. I don't know if people have heard of him, but he's somebody that I would consider a friend and mentor. And I've told him how thankful I am of him just inspiring me and encouraging me in his own ways of helping me throughout this process. And there's been other people that no one would ever have heard of. There's people that I worked in groups for, some activist groups in Florida that I carry my conversations with them. A couple women in St. Pete for Peace was the organization I worked for. The deep conversations we had always stay with me. And, it's just, those are things that I'm looking for out here, that I'm trying to find out here that I had out in Florida. But like, I'm sure like you doing this work, you get to meet some fantastic people, and yeah, you maybe record some conversations with them, but you also get to have fantastic conversations with them when the recorder isn't on. And that helps tremendously.
Yeah. Yeah. I never would have guessed that so many of the influences that I have had since I was a kid, a number of shamanic or energetic mentors, people who have taught me about the energetic realm or the shamanic realm, and other people who are just some of the finest trainers, you know, in usual stand-up training of corporate or personal development stuff, and on the list goes. And I had no idea that come the 21st century, and they would all start to fit together, and they would be a remarkable and empowering fit, you know, because that's really what I'm drawn on to put together, particularly the workbook and the practices that are going to be a part of that. That's another part of that time to not be polite anymore thing is I find that I'm growing really tired of just talk. You know, there's only so much of just talk, and then what I can predict is that the business as usual paradigm will suck the value out of even the best conversation in pretty short order.
Yeah.
What I think we're talking about kind of in the background is that really what's called for now is really embodying. This is a time of embodying and presence, whereas before it was fake it till you make it, and you know, keep producing and keep reaching for the next rung on the ladder, and so on and so on. And I think those days are done.
Do you find when you have conversations with people and you tell them kind of what you provide analysis of what you think's happening, does somebody try to shut down that conversation with you by saying, well, that's never going to happen, you know, as far as things that would help society? Has anyone ever said that to you? I get that all the time. Well, you know, that's not going to happen, and you can't control it, and you're not going to make that happen. Well, I'm not trying. I know it's not an individual thing where I'm going to make it happen, but I think it's a worthy fight to have. I think it's worthy to fight for getting something right, even if it's for a little bit.
When you're asking that question, I'm drawn to the article that that I really wanted to get to in our conversation today, that you wrote. I believe you called it "Assholes Finish First."
Yep.
And I think it's built in. It's built into our culture, that violence that we've been talking about sporadically in this conversation. Part of that violence and part of the bullying of our culture is to assert and then just really pound others with, this is the only model for human activity that will ever be. It's literally that seamless as a weapon as a cultural weapon. And that's part of what I read when you were talking about assholes finish first. You know, that's clearly what this whole culture is built on, is the supremacy of this model.
Well, and the fact that it's human nature. I mean, this is just who humans are. It gives a built-in excuse to go be an asshole, because that's just who we are. And that's not who we've been. You know, maybe this culture, Western culture, that's what it's been, but there's other cultures that it has not been that way.
Yeah.
That's a myth.
Yeah. I think we're right at the crux of when I put together that response to what got us here, when I kept saying we've disconnected. And then when I took it that inch further and said, so it won't get real till we really start to articulate what the disconnection has cost us. And we literally don't know what we don't know about our culture, because it is all we see. It's all we're submersed in all the time. So we don't give a shit that there have been other cultures that have done it differently or have not disconnected in that way. So it's an extraordinary self-reinforcing feedback loop of making ourselves right about just how fucked up we are, and we're as happy as clams within that. Wow.
And I take it as this too, you know, what we do when something's unpleasant, let's just ignore it, it'll go away. We don't confront it. And now we're paying the price for that. We've ignored the fact that we're in a model of infinite growth on a finite planet. We've ignored the fact that, you know, power isn't through words, it's through forces, and it's through willing something, it's through force. And yeah, someone may say something that makes them out to be an asshole because of the things they say, and you'll be told to ignore that. But what they fail to connect is that person also is imposing their will on other people, and you can't ignore that. And we have, and now it's time to suffer the consequences, unfortunately, for that. And like you said, yeah, we were born in these, you know, we were born in these set of living arrangements, and this happened before all of us came onto the planet. But I think I agree with what you're saying, that it's really ramping up now, and we can't ignore that now, because, you know, when I think about how my life's going to end, I think about all the different possibilities, and I'd like the most peaceful possible way if I can get it. And I know ignoring assholes who are enforcing and imposing their will on us is not going to lead to that.
So there's another kind of crux point that I'm wrestling with in this new book that I'm wondering if you have anything to say about it. The statistics seem to be, depending on which survey one's, you know, paying attention to, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of us never have conversations of consequence with anyone in our lives, family, friends, nothing. So of consequence meaning, you know, the things that truly matter that you and I are talking about, or even a layer or two different, something to do with being able to continue humanity as we know it, having enough political interest to be able to speak with other people about what needs to happen in the community, blah, blah, blah. To me, that statistic is literally jaw-dropping. That and this is the USA, somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of us never have conversations of consequence of that type. It's as staggering to me on the kind of receiving end as back at the beginning of our conversation, you were talking about what one thing that very definitely has your attention is the violence wrapped far right as they prepare to have a far stronger presence in our world, and not just USA, but around the world. That's jaw-dropping to me on the producing end. So that's the producing side of the equation, and the receiving side of the equation is the silence or the complicity or the just kind of the reticence, just hanging out, just living life and not talking about it and hoping it will go away. Let me just lean back on the side of 2/3 to 3/4 of us being silent about that which matters most to us. Does that spark you to say anything? Do you have any?
It's jaw-dropping. I mean, like you said, that's from the United States, right? Is that what you're citing?
That's
I mean,
USA.
that is shocking.
Mm-hmm.
But what I instantly think about when you say that is I think about this is what it's like to live in an empire, that you have the privilege of just going through life and not having to suffer some of the consequences that other people in other parts of the world have to suffer. And I agree with a lot of what Abby Martin says when we're a nation of empire babies, because when we can't go through life aimlessly and some little thing gets in our way, we lose our minds over it. And that's part of being an empire baby. And, you know, it in a way, like when you say that, when you say the statistic, it's shocking. But when you think about what's been going on with people in this country, at least some people, they get to go through life aimlessly.
Yeah.
And there's others in this country that don't. And I think people need to get out there and talk to some people that don't have that luxury to get a reality check on what this world can do to others and other segments of the population. You know, go talk to some people in the transgender community right now and ask them how they're feeling. Go talk to people that are undocumented immigrants or just immigrants in general. My old boss, if you looked at my old boss, you would think that she's just Black. She's not. She is Black and Hispanic, and she's from Colombia. And, you know, we used to have to go to meetings in Tallahassee, and I lived in the Tampa area. And we would have to, just hearing the fright that she'd have in going some areas of the state. There's a nice it's called Route 19. You could take to Tallahassee. It's a 4.5-hour drive. You could take back roads and you go through these small towns, and it makes things a little bit more interesting than going on a freeway. But we couldn't do that with her because she said if something were to happen to that car and I were to be caught in one of those towns, I would fear for my safety. Mm-hmm. I think people need to be around segments of society that can have conversations like that, because I don't remember the statistic, but something along the lines of it was like another majority, an overwhelming majority, just like you cited here in the United States, that most white people don't have non-white friends, right? So that is, I think, a big problem, is that we need to broaden our horizons, look at other people from other races, other cultures, other ways of life. And maybe some of those conversations happen organically, because I learned so much from her, and she's not even an activist or a political organizer, but just having life conversations with her and talking about her background has had a tremendous impact on me and will for the rest of my life.
Yeah. All right.
There's somebody out there unfortunately, there's somebody next door to me that's working on a car, and they decided today, out of all days, that they'd work on a car outside. So my dog hears the person banging on their car. But I can go move her if you need me to.
No. In fact, I'm thinking we're getting close to wrapping up this particular episode, and what I'd like to do is plant a seed with you for a future conversation, because I know I just sent you off my book that I put out last year, which already feels so ancient, you know, and much of it we've actually covered in today's conversation. And I'm particularly interested in fleshing out the conversation a bit more at a later time, if it works for you to do so.
Oh, absolutely, anytime.
Particularly about that the foundation of violence underneath almost every element of our conversation today. It happens to be current for me because that's where I'm at in this new book. But you know, it's interesting. There's something every time I hear one of your conversations in your podcast, a few of them with Patrick, and I'm particularly thinking about Dr. Bones right now, that I know you both have talked to. There's something about that kind of raw edge that is particularly appropriate right now. And it's one part of the conversation, that I think has multiple pieces. It's not all that gritty, and it's not all about violence, but those are really distinct and important elements of this conversation that so very, very few people are having right now. And so, what I'd like to do is, if I could just plant a seed, perhaps in a month or two, get
Definitely.
back together and see how these seedlings are growing.
And I think I would just, one thing to say is, I think people, if anyone's listening to this and you have not heard Dr. Bones, I would highly recommend listening to the Guillotine podcast, because it is the podcast that pulls at your heartstrings. And every time I listen to that, I always reevaluate where I'm at in my life and start wondering, what am I doing? And it makes me really want to do something, and it's motivating. And we need more conversations like that. And to have it from two articulate individuals like Brett and Dr. Bones is a thing that we should cherish.
Right. I'll be sure to put links to your podcast, and particularly that episode, or however many episodes you've done with Dr. Bones, and I will put his links as well. Perhaps I can find a way to get in touch with him and have a conversation with him as well.
I could send you along his email if you needed it. I mean,
I would appreciate that. Thank you.
The one thing I like too is, what I tell people is, anyone who's doing this type of work, no matter who it is that reaches out to you, have that conversation with them. It's important. Mm-hmm. And he does that. And he's, I'm sure you've had these situations where you've interviewed a couple people and kind of walk away thinking, I liked them, but they're not what I thought they would be.
Yeah.
Is when I walked away from my conversation with him, it made me think he's an even better person than I already thought. And that's rare. It's not necessarily rare, but when you find those people, hold those people close to you and listen to what they have to do, because they're true and they're genuine.
Yeah. Maybe you already did that in what you just got through saying, but I'm wondering if you had a minute to put out a broadcast message to a far, far larger audience, and you had the chance to open up your heart and give it your best shot to speak with far, far more people in this minute, what would you say?
Slow down. Please slow down. I know life comes at us fast, and I know it's so micromanaged on what we're supposed to do and when we're supposed to do it. And at this age, we're supposed to do this, and at that age, we're supposed to do that. Mm-hmm. But take time for yourself to slow down and to think. We need that time to daydream, and that time to just be spontaneous and not know what we're going to do next, and maybe just sit with our thoughts. Because sometimes those are the times that you need, that will help build some of your ideology and some of your thoughts and your thought process and what your beliefs are. If you don't take that time, I think that leads to a lot of depression and a lot of anxiety. And you need to find ways to have things slow down for you in these times where everything else in a negative way is unfortunately speeding up for us.
Yeah. Well, Rob, it's just been a real pleasure to meet you and to hear you put some detail, put some flesh on the bones of things that I've heard you open up with other folks in other conversations. And I want to thank you so much for your work, and also thank you so much for living the particularly courageous track of being almost a parent. These aren't very encouraging times for that track, and I think there's a particular brand of courage that it takes to be as collapse aware as you are, and to have the kind of robust commitment to being alive as you obviously have. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. And thank you for your work. And there's one other thing that I forgot to say in my minute. If I could extend it for another 15
We
seconds.
can give you another minute.
Okay. Please, this is the other thing I would beg for people is please embrace your vulnerability.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to show your vulnerability, because that's what writing is. That's what I did. And yes, you're going to get some flack for it and you're going to get attacked for it, but you're going to get some love back and some support back from people you never thought that would happen. And it can be from people all over the world with the way we're connected now. So embrace that, because that is what can help you move forward and keep your head high in days of trouble and in days of darkness.
Great. Well, thank you again. Just been an absolute joy. And I wish you well. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving in the next week or so. And I look forward to whatever excuse we can come up with to talk some more, hopefully early in 2019.
Absolutely. And I look forward to reading your book, and I look forward to reaching out to you to have you on my show eventually so we can continue a conversation.
I look forward to it. Thanks so much, Rob.
Thank you, Dean.
Thanks for watching another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast, produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance, www.livingresilience.net. Music today from Michael Hedges, as always, and also Port Blue Into the Sea. You may want to check out our sister podcasts, the New Lifeboat Hour with Carolyn Baker on Podbean and at carolynbaker.net. Also, the Impossible Conversation podcast, another channel on YouTube. Thanks so much for joining us. Join us again later for another episode of the Poetry of Predicament.